Today is Monday, April 22nd. It's 6:05, and I'm calling to order this meeting of the Brattleboro Planning Commission. First order of business is to approve the minutes from April 8th.
I move the minutes be approved.
I
Okay.
second.
Okay, any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No abstentions?
It's good that we didn't have any discussion because one would have even had a moment to take a breath to say yes or no.
That's true.
You're very good at that.
I did ask for discussion.
I guess.
It's like Jeopardy. You need a little beeper so you can do it
You're
real
right,
quick.
you're not
Gotta
quick.
get in there.
Your light's not on, it's not over.
Announcements. I have nothing to announce. Anybody on the commission or staff have any announcements?
Green Up Day is May 4th. We have bags in the office if you want to grab any.
Look at this.
And then
So many people we need in the chat.
We had a nice event with the EPA last week. I guess maybe we should announce that.
we have that on there.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
before that.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no public here, so we can skip public comment. And let's have a report on the EPA's technical assistance. Am I too close here?
To me?
Or do you want to start?
I'm fine.
I'm okay.
Both do it.
I'll back up a little.
You start.
So we had two consultants come in from Virginia through the EPA Technical Assistance Grant Program. And they were here on Tuesday and Wednesday. So Tuesday evening we kind of kicked off the workshop with kind of an overview of rural smart growth and what are the benefits of it and why do you want to do it even in a no growth
Sitting.
setting. So that was pretty well attended. We probably had around 25 people there that evening, and they, including some from our neighboring towns, planning commissions. So that was good. Kind of the focus that evening was really on kind of towns working together.
Did the select board go to that one?
No, they had a select board meeting here.
Oh,
at
okay.
that time too.
Right.
So then on Wednesday morning, we had a breakfast session, which some of you attended at 7:30, that was geared towards town department heads and the select board. And so we had good representation from the town municipal government. And that one, they again had kind of a brief presentation of what had been presented the night before. And then just some discussion. Add to that one.
One of the key things was that I think we had some senior staff there, as the Director of Public Works and so forth, so there was a good balance of management and appointed people as well as, so it was a good cross-section of the key decision makers and stakeholders. And I think one of the challenges that we've had when we've talked about subdivision regulations and so forth is to actually make sure that the road commission the road design component is well enough attended to. And I think that was an effective area of the presentation in the morning. So it was good.
So then the workshop began at 9:30, and some of you were there. Mark was there, Timberly was there off and on, and Liz was there for that. And we had it was a smaller group for the workshop, but again with some people from neighboring commissions. And there we focused specifically on conservation subdivisions, appropriate densities in the periphery area, so in our rural areas. And then in the afternoon, we worked on PUDs, reforming PUDs, and agricultural and natural resource protection. And so I would say out of the morning, we split into three groups, and we were addressing, barriers? We discussed some incentives to putting in place and kind of what are the gaps and how can we move forward. And it seemed that there was pretty universal support for conservation subdivisions. People liked the idea of clustering. What was not resolved, though, was what is the appropriate density?
Right. The mathematical component.
What did they say about the bonus system?
About incentives?
Yeah.
Basically, it works where you've got enough heat in the market to direct a developer. First of all, enough heat in the market and a long enough period of time that you have basically professional developers.
And we have none of that.
Right. And that it, because, the incentives are a clear payoff for them. So the performance of incentives for us is somewhat muted. But
Yeah. But it was interesting, in my group, there was talk about kind of stripping down what is the goal of the conservation subdivision. I think we've looked at past meetings, kind of categorizing everything that's special about the site, including cellar holes and stone walls and trails and this and that. And it seemed, coming from my group, the direction was keep it at the more global level, like the working landscape level, or just really something unique natural feature-wise, and that's the level it should be at. And then maybe you could come in and incentivize on the other things. But they also felt that actually a good development would take into account the trails and that kind of thing. So anyway, it was interesting to think about moving forward, especially as we ask for information on what should be included in submission.
Do you guys think that this means the incentive is pointless in this environment, or should it be more extreme, or is it just, well, this is one of the frustrating things we have to talk about every time we do new regulations?
My gut reaction is I think that we can't necessarily depend on the incentive to maybe make up for a loss in density.
Right. So I think that it goes back to the thresholds. It goes back to the minimum parcel sizes, and then reading off from that what the appropriate density levels are. And so I think in the most simple version, one kind of carrot and stick equation is, if you want to obtain the current densities, that is, say you're in rural residential, that would be 1 dwelling unit per 1.5 acres, or in rural, 1 dwelling unit per 3 acres, then you have to do conservation subdivision. If you don't do conservation subdivision, then the minimum parcel size is 3 and 10, respectively. And so that's pretty blunt, but pretty straightforward. And so there is an incentive to follow conservation subdivision strategies if you want a higher yield, and that would be the way to do it.
I thought it was interesting how they were talking about the, did they use the word encroachment, but all those little lots along the road.
Yes.
And then the empty kind of big parcels behind it.
That are difficult to access. Yes, they did talk about that in terms of fragmentation.
Fragmentation. That was
And, explicitly addressed sort of the hazard of fragmentation. The other thing that, some of the more interesting things that we were having a little bit of a hard time resolving, at least in the office, I guess, mentally, was the instance of a long-standing farming family wanting to break off smaller sections of land to will or give to the next generation. I can't remember what, I was struggling to remember what they called that.
Family lot splits.
Family lot splits, that's right. It sounds like something you can get at a drive-through barbecue. But so they're from Virginia. They had that kind of accent. So anyway, a family lot split would provide for that instance where one generation is basically breaking up parts of the farm, but wanting to keep it intact for the next generation, and then you just put a limit on the number of years the split off lot would have to be held by the same family.
And I would say they didn't even suggest that just for farming.
Right.
Just that kind of addresses that want to cut a piece off.
Yeah.
A child or whatever.
Yeah, that's true.
It doesn't just have to be for farming.
Right.
Oh, I thought another thing that struck me is we've struggled here about how do you, in a conservation subdivision, the open space. How do you manage the open space? And what they were saying is that there are examples where that open space lot is actually a developable lot, but it's just got one.
Or a farm,
Yeah.
Right.
a preserved farm.
Farm.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense,
Yes.
especially with that family
Right.
business.
Right.
Yeah,
so you take
it
those two
does,
things
and-
together, and you actually get a pretty good solution. So in
And
that
it
instance,
simplifies the
Right.
need for an easement or
Right.
some sort of homeowners association, so that definitely.
right. So you could have clustered houses on the edge of a large farmer's field, and then at the end of that farmer's field, you could have the original farmhouse or something. The original farmhouse and the field stay as one lot, and the activity continues, and that is the designated open space.
The
So
farm activity would still
Yep.
continue.
right. So it can't be
Would that
developed
be
for something else.
contingent then On that house, that's
Yes.
staying?
I mean that would. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the farming could end, but it couldn't be subdivided any further.
Right.
Okay.
So, worst case, so if they're probably, assume they're haying it now and they don't want to hay it anymore, then somebody else is going to have to hay it, right? Which shouldn't be too hard to arrange. And then the other homes are clustered closer together, and they gain the benefit of the working landscape as open space. But they don't have to go through if you like, the trauma of forming a homeowners association or something similar to manage it. Because then it
There was
occurred to me that that's exactly what the arrangement that I'm living with right now. There's no homeowner. It's just people's land. In fact, no one's ever particularly clear about whose bit is which. But the same guy comes and hays it every year. So yeah.
Sounds medieval.
Instead of a pond,
It is.
Like torture. Sounds like medieval torture.
Conserved land too?
It absolutely, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. I mean, maybe that's something that can be incentivized,
Right.
but therefore it's, but by allowing it to be a developed parcel or whatever used to continue going on it, it's not necessarily seen as an obstacle to do
Right.
conservation.
So all you're really saying is no more development is going to happen on this parcel. But it is an already developed lot. And I would think there's quite a few that would fall into that category that I'm thinking of in Brattleboro. Right?
There was a lot of talk about both farming, like agricultural and forest land in town, and agricultural and forest industry in town that wasn't readily apparent to most of the people in the room. So I think we should, I have a better understanding of that, especially as it relates to the subdivision.
Sorry, I missed it.
At some point in the course of the
Go the
thinking,
next day as well.
shouldn't we also consider whether or not we want to try to raise minimum lot size?
In rural and rural residential?
Yeah.
Yeah, most certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say what I was referring to before is probably, at this point, our preferred approach. That the new minimum parcel sizes would be 3 in rural residential and 10 in rural. And the only way to actually get denser than that, for want of a better term, is to go conservation subdivision.
Milt, before they left, we had breakfast with them, and he had mentioned to us that it might, in the rural residential area, not the rural, in the rural area, we might even want to consider looking at having no minimum lot size, but looking at a
Yes.
yield-based approach, and then, which we're going to kind of see a little bit of tonight, or kind of a developable area which determines the yield, but then requiring the clustering. So,
Oh,
Right.
that's interesting.
Yep.
yeah.
Yield as opposed to,
Yeah.
yield in regards to how many houses?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you would take the tract of land, we'll see it in the subdivision regulations here tonight, and then subtract out the undevelopable area,
Yeah,
and
that's what we're
then,
talking about.
so then figure out how many,
Right. So in all these kinds of conversations, what ends up happening is that the existing property owners or even future property owners are really fixate on a minimum parcel size because it's the highest practical number that they can achieve for a given parcel.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you tell somebody that you can have 10 parcels on 10 properties on, or 10 homes on 10 acres, they all of a sudden they do the math and they go, I want 10. and because you've just told them that that's the maximum they can have. Whereas the reality is, you get there and you go, well, there's that cliff, and then that brook, and that wetland, and that thing there.
That's what
and
we
that
were
thing there.
struggling with at
Yeah.
Right.
that meeting.
And you end up with an effective, buildable area of 6.5 or 7. But you just told them that they can have 10, and so they don't want to come back down.
I think that's a great idea.
And so
Yeah.
then
It makes it so much more palatable, and it's direct with what
Right.
we're trying to do. I'm sorry.
They don't start off from a position of being disappointed.
Right.
Yeah.
And for us, what it means is that we've got enough information now, I think, through BioFinder and other, mapping resources, where we can have a reasonably informed discussion about, in fact, what your yield could be.
And this would be in the planning office when a developer comes in, not necessarily before the DRB.
Be it the application.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in order for it to work, they'd have to
Have
be.
to be prepared to go to the DRB for it, but
Yeah, but I think the conversations would have to be.
yeah, start with us, with the information that we have.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say, and I think most design professionals around here and historians would accept that all the really easy stuff to build is already built on. I mean that even explains Putney Road to some extent. It's wide and it's flat and it's got relatively easy soils. Guess what? That's why it looks like the way it does. It was farmland and now it's not. When you start getting into the outer reaches of West Brattleboro towards Marlborough and Dummerston, it's tough going. Mark knows that.
Yeah, there could be ledge near the surface too.
Well, there's all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you're
Septic stuff.
and that gets back to the information that we've had from Denny, Frizzy, and others that a buildable lot, a reasonable buildable lot, is $75,000, and it might be anywhere in size between 5 and 15 acres. But there's other variables, but really a lot you can easily get onto from the road that you're accessing it from.
Would we still be able to have our 2 methods of calculation system if we did it this way?
You mean using the GIS
Yes.
data or having the developer?
If a developer really wants to push it to really get
Yeah,
on.
but I think it would
Yeah.
have to start from that initial carving out of what's environmentally valuable.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think if a developer is going to do it, they would be depending on survey data, whereas if they were going to use ours, we're going to use GIS data and
Right.
the
So if they,
state's database.
if they want to
based
challenge
on
it,
that.
that's fine.
Right, there's no reason
the
not to.
obligation is on them
Right.
to come up with information that basically says, well, look, you're at this resolution.
Yeah.
One pixel equals 20 feet, whereas I'm working at 1 pixel equals 5 feet, and I can tell you that it's not there, it's over there, and all that kind of stuff. Or I went and looked, and that rock outcrop is not the way you think it is. It's like this.
I think we should do it that way. I mean, I think it's really meaningful that the person who was publicly against the increased lot size at the town plan select board meeting was probably the person who's best approximated what we're trying to do, just by virtue of what he wanted to do. Thurber.
Yeah.
I mean, he did it through conservation easements and maybe didn't think about the numbers of the density, but I'm sure that the result he wanted is the result that we're trying to get.
Right.
Can we reach out to him and see if
Stu?
he
Yeah,
likes
sure.
this idea?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
he's on
a
the
good idea.
Agriculture Advisory Committee, and the last time we met, he actually had suggested having a meeting so we could talk about land use. And because he wanted to understand more about
Right.
what we were proposing in the
I
town
think
plan. So.
that's a great idea. I mean, that to me is like the Bliker stuff, reach out to those, whatever that set of initials was on it.
Yeah. Yeah, we had invited the Agricultural Advisory Committee and other members of the farming community to the
But there's
workshop.
people who just, I think, the meetings that I heard correctly, and even in some of our hearings, people that some of it might have just been knee-jerk reaction that, to the 3 and 10, but because they just don't want any. But I think there's a group of people that, if we educated them and answered their questions, that would make a huge piece of difference.
Sure. I think so.
So that we know.
I thought another interesting thing that came out of my group, and the rest of you can speak to your groups, was questioning the rural residential and what, really what is
What is
that district. Everybody can look at the rural and say, oh yeah, that's got this hill, and these are really nice areas, but what are we trying to achieve in the rural residential? And it was a good perspective to have as we move forward.
Was rural residential set up because it was rural area that then got
Yes, I believe
developments
so.
put on it,
Yeah,
so
I mean,
they
I think
call
it's
it
more of a reflection of the existing development
yeah,
pattern.
yeah.
Given the history of zoning in Brattleboro, it has that funny, so it's like after the fact.
Yeah.
You know.
When I think about the areas where there's
Right.
like even Carriage Hill, excuse me, probably years ago, before that was built, that was just, the line for West Brattleboro was in closer as the development went. The rural line got pushed out further and further.
Yeah.
The dangers of the round table.
Yeah, really.
So would we have two different yields for rural residential and rural then, if we were to take away minimum and just go by yield? Or I realize we're not making a decision now, but do you think we should? Do you guys think we should?
Could I get a definition of the term yield in this usage?
Yeah. Okay.
I
So
mean, I have a general idea, but
and basically, the yield is just the proportion of the developable cluster area versus the conserved area. Is that fair to say?
No, when
No.
when I use yield,
oh, good.
It's always good when you're chairman. It's completely.
The number of bushels, and you're talking about
the number of lots,
lots
Yes.
that you put.
the number
So,
of lots that you can
if-
get off the.
Right.
what I'm
so
trying to say.
If you're in rural residential,
Yep.
and the minimum parcel size is, well, let's go with the math of rural because it's easier. Minimum parcel size is 3 acres, right? So right now, if you've got a 30-acre lot,
Yep.
Not sure they work, Liz.
yeah,
Yeah.
the reality is that they're just there for show.
They
So-
don't work.
So you've got 10 parcels, right?
Yep.
Okay. You change the minimum parcel size. You turn it into 6 or something, and you've just reduced your yield, right?
Yes.
So the yield calculation is a hypothetical number.
Yes.
So the way I like to explain this is with reference to the kids game, which is not that much of a kids game anymore, like SimCity, right? Where it's just an algorithm, and that's what generates the land use. And so, in fact, SimCity is very effective for teaching these kind of things. So that's it, And so you mess with a number, and then you mess with the equation.
Yeah,
That's it.
I get the math.
Right.
So are we saying the number of buildable houses per some number of acres?
Lots.
Lots.
Lots, not houses.
Yeah, and
Buildable
we would
lots.
just be
Okay.
making that proportion
And then those lots could be any size the developer wants them to be, as long as there's that many
as long as the right amount
lots,
is
as long as the
conserved.
number, as long as the right amount is conserved, right?
Yeah.
So if the yield is 20% or 80%, depending on your perspective, 80% conserved and
20% developed, yes.
20% developed, can I develop as much as I want in that 20%?
No.
You'd get that number of lots as your maximum, 20.
Right.
Like, if you have 100 acres, you get 20 lots.
You get 20.
Put on
Okay.
this little area.
Well, no, what you would do, you wouldn't necessarily get.
Keep
I'm glad,
I mean-
I'm glad I asked this
Listen to
Well,
what
question.
it's
I
getting a
said.
little because we don't have something in front of you, but you might set some parameters. You might actually say you could say you have to have a minimum of a half an acre.
Yep.
But you're not saying you, how does I want to say? You could put a maximum.
I mean, obviously, you could do any of these things, obviously,
Yes.
right? You could have a certain yield of undevelopable. I mean, any of these are variables. I get that, and I guess that's what we're trying to decide is
Right.
how do we split these things
Yeah.
out? I mean,
Yeah. I think what you end up doing is you actually do say you have to have a minimum of a half an acre or something like that. And it's different than having a minimum lot size because you could,
Because if you cluster, you might not do it that way.
well,
I mean, you could have 4 houses on an acre for
Yeah, I
clustering.
mean-
Right.
So it wouldn't be half acre lot size at all.
right.
Why is it necessary to have a minimum?
I agree.
Because you still want to be able to control the number of houses out there and so that you can make sure that it's sufficient.
But aren't you doing that by limiting the number of lots? I mean, if you have a set number of lots and you have the area conserved you want to conserve, why do you want to further regulate the lots? I'm sure.
I think it's a good question because some people like to live in high density, even if it's only 10 houses. Even if it's
Well,
only
it's the
10 houses,
pattern.
those people that like to live in high density should have the option to live in high density. If it's still the same number of houses per however many acres,
Well,
why do we
no,
care how
no.
close together
But
they are?
in the zone, I mean, the people who want to live in the rural and the rural residential shouldn't live at the same densities that they do in the whole eastern half of the town. I mean, the whole thrust of the plan is to have high density in the core and rural density in the rural areas.
I see but you're saying something a little bit different, almost like, I think the term medieval came up before. So, pre-auto, rural life in somewhere like the United Kingdom, where, you'd ride on your horse or your pig or whatever, and you'd come to a bunch of little stone cottages all clustered around a mill wheel or something, and there'd be a pub. And then immediately after leaving that, it goes just straight back to rural, and so you've got these a cluster of stone
Thomas
cottages.
Hardy zoning.
Right, that's right. We'll call it Thomas Hardy zoning, and they're all living incredibly close together. In fact, they're sort of like row houses or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I'd say there is that's the kind of, that's one vision, and it's okay, but that's the outgrowth of the lord of the manor and the peasants in the village who are farming the lord's land. And as soon as you sort of like introduce the notion of democracy and this could be yours, people are pretty clear that they like quite a bit. And particularly if you've got a car to drive up and down the driveway all day long. So then you get more spread out. So I think that while that's quaint and interesting and it's not bad in kind of the early 21st century conception of things, because you could service that little node of houses with a bus and all that kind of stuff, it still kind of works in an interesting way. I think the expectation here is that it would be very much a minority interest for a group of people to want to go somewhere fairly remote, like up towards the reservoir on Pleasant Valley Road or something, and then cluster as tightly together as if they were on Canal Street. I think that's just a little unusual, and so.
And it's recreating the fragmentation that we talked about before.
Yeah, it wouldn't be. I mean, depending on how you did it. I mean, if you did a really nice, very compact kind of clustering thing, I can imagine it actually being okay. But I seriously doubt there's much of a market for it. So
I don't think we should guess at what we think the market is.
No, but
we should regulate as appropriate to regulate, and then let the market do what it's going to do.
But there still should be zones for different purposes.
right.
Sure.
And so the rural zone would be a different purpose than
Right, but does
downtown.
it have to be, this much open in half acres, or could it just as easily be this much open and then whatever the people in the market decide they want of those same number of units, right? Same number of units, which actually is more open space.
When I said, you'd have a minimum lot, I don't know if I said it would be a minimum lot size. That's for purposes of calculating density, but you could actually develop it up on smaller, and I know I'm not really making much sense right now. But you need a way to calculate the density of the developable area, and that's hard to
Right.
do without tying it to some sort of minimum lot size, even though there's no parameters on the actual lot size.
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
any clearer?
So
Well, there needs to be a minimum size at which you can put a house.
I think you're
because
putting
it
an old
could be like a
paradigm. I think you're putting an old
postage stamp.
paradigm into what we're trying to calculate. The old paradigm is lot size, right?
Yeah.
Really, but what we're saying is housing units per whatever number of acres. Where they sit on those acres, we know we want them to sit somewhat together so that a whole big patch of it cannot be developed. But what we're really saying is this many houses on this many acres, leaving whatever the number is, 75%, 85% open, which leaves 15% of that available. And should those houses be able to go anywhere on that 15%? Or do they have to have a minimum size within that 15%? Because the old paradigm we all use is this number of per house. And what if we just forget that, if we can erase it from our minds?
You're talking about a housing commune.
If you choose to use that term, you can feel free to do so.
One of the examples that gave our group pause was everybody mentioned Whetstone Heights. Or one person mentioned Whetstone Heights.
Do you want to explain to other people who Whetstone Heights is?
Off of William Street, across from Crosby. It's like a 3-acre parcel with...
You go up a hill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like a 3-acre parcel with...
Up a steep hill.
Up a steep hill with
It's on a plateau mostly.
8 houses in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something like that.
Right. It was developed as a PUD.
Yeah.
And everybody questioned whether the road could support it, or various people within the group, I'm sorry, and whether the infrastructure was actually there. These were sidebar conversations.
Well,
Yeah.
so
Made everybody
this was,
stop
this,
talking about what we were talking.
was this developed, or it's just been subdivided?
Oh no, it's developed.
Oh,
And does the road support it? And are there sufficient utilities?
The actual physical road, the private road that services the houses, is in okay condition. The intersection with William Street is not okay.
yeah.
And so I think Mark's example is a good one. I mean, the only thing I'd say about that that kind of undercuts that example a wee bit is, the surrounding neighborhood is pretty developed. I mean, it was sort of like the last chunk of land in that neighborhood. Yeah. So, and the rest of it is settled really densely. So that neighborhood, Sweetville,
Yeah.
around Crosby Street, they're diminutive, early 1800s houses on really steep lots, and they're pretty small. It's packed in pretty tight already. So in terms of the character of the neighborhood, in fact, it's kind of consistent or a little bit more relaxed than that. So it's kind of got
Quite
a
a different level of quality.
urban kind of feel to the whole thing. I think from a practical standpoint, if it wasn't for a PUD, every one of those houses is non-conforming. So the setbacks, or the dimensional setbacks, which is another, which is, I was going to use the word dimension again in a different way, but so there's another aspect here. When we identify a parcel in a particular zoning district, we apply dimensional standards to it. So side and rear and front setbacks. So take your example of really packing them in because everyone wants to be really packed in. That's okay. But I think in a setting such as that, then you'd need to end up discussing
Sure.
exactly those
You still
kinds
need
of things.
dimensional.
Right.
Sure.
Well, and I think,
Well, you have
I mean-
setbacks there, don't you?
I've never even seen
Aren't there
one.
minimum setbacks in rural?
where?
In rural?
Yeah.
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 Well, that would dictate a minimum lot size.
You'd end up with a
No,
Pretty
but you
certainly.
kind of, if you're clustering, you're often relaxing those.
right.
Oh.
Right.
So I think that what we need to be careful not to do is to allow too much where then it stresses the capacity of the municipality to service it, either through roads or,
Right.
busing and that kind of thing.
In which case, we'd want them closer together, not farther apart.
No,
And
in
my
which case
point
we,
is
mo-
we
we
should
might
not-
want them somewhere else where we've already got the utilities to handle that.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's
Okay.
on the developer, right? I mean, they're gonna, to me, any developer, when he's thinking about his market, if he's gonna build out in the middle of nowhere, he's probably not gonna put a house on .26 acres,
He or she.
he or
Yeah.
she.
Then.
I'm just used to it. Yeah, I mean, I get what Jim is saying, and having a minimum lot size, especially if you're doing the conservation subdivision, if they're close together, it would be cheaper from both standpoints, maintaining the road, running utilities.
Yep.
A lot of the co-housing types of developments that I've seen, even though they're in rural areas, I mean, some of them don't even have roads. They have like one big parking area and they just walk to all these places.
Yep.
And how does that work?
That's the commune part.
The reason I was questioning is different than that, but I was thinking that if you had your sort of, call it the development envelope, where you can put your X number of units, you might want, say, 2 bigger lots, and you build 2 big houses that are basically the same, and then the rest being small. And if you had a minimum lot size, you'd have a tendency to, I think, end up with a uniform lot grid sort of thing in the development envelope. Maybe not, but that's what gives me the willies, because I would think maybe if you wanted to develop, you'd want to, say, bookend it with nice houses that
Well, but remember, a
frontage.
minimum is minimum.
Right.
You can choose to do more than that.
I think we're also sort of slipping
Yeah.
back towards sort of the SimCity thing, where the land is homogeneous, or all the features are identically distributed, and so you can just get your mouse and go up and down and see what the difference is, rather than, for all sorts of practical and obvious reasons, this parcel is going to be just under 1/4 of an acre, and the one next to it's just going to be over 1/4 of an acre, and that one over there is going to be 2/3 of an acre, and all those kinds of things, because
And we don't want that.
No, I'm okay with that. I mean, all I'm saying is that, if we lived somewhere like Indiana, where if you saw it from Google Earth, has this appearance, both in color and presentation, and all it is a matter of getting your lines out and going, I could cut this thing up like this, or I could cut this thing up like this. What do I want to do? 4 or 40?
But I mean, might the undulating land be an argument against minimum lot sizes, because you may have an unusual small buildable area that would support a house, but nothing else?
I think the challenges that we have, to be really honest, actually are probably more present with why we come up with dimensional standards and what we're attempting to do. And in rural, residential, and rural, there is no guarantee. In fact, the best way to understand both those districts is that they're beyond the water and sewer network.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of the obvious things that you need to take into account if you're wanting to sell a buildable parcel is, this is big enough for your house, this is big enough for some accessory structures like a carport or a garage or a shed or a kid's playhouse, it's big enough for a well, and that well is going to be far enough away from your septic system, and then the backup septic system, and it's going to be far enough away from your neighbor's septic systems, of which you'll possibly have up to 3.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So all of a sudden, the reality is, given rocks and holes and other features, you start ending up growing to a reasonably sized parcel, and I would hazard a guess that you're pretty close to probably almost an acre once you start taking those things into consideration.
If it's a conservation subdivision, wells and leach fields have to be within that.
You can share them, but
It depends on how
it depends.
Yeah.
I mean,
how the
there's-
developer does it.
It's
You can share it.
You can
have a
share it. You
community.
can have a community septic and you can have a community well. But this then gets you back into a much more complicated ownership structure and those kinds of things. What we're saying is, what are the minimum requirements that we could envisage so that it's workable for each individual property owner that wants to live in that configuration, assuming that they don't have to enter into any subsequent more complicated legal agreements. So, for straight away, the ability to persuade your bank that you really want to live there gets really a lot tougher when you have to say, well, and then there's the shared septic, and then there's the shared well, and then there's the shared childcare on Wednesday nights, and then there's this, and then there's that, and then after a while the bank is like, you know what, we're not that thrilled. Whereas if you just walk in and go, this is it, it's $275,000, and I get an acre, and I get a septic, and I get a well, and I can put my garage over there when I'm ready, I'm good, and they go,
And
we're good too.
The idea behind this is that we don't have the sophisticated developer, in theory,
Right,
and we're protecting people
right.
from doing something stupid that's going to make them lose their shirt.
We don't
Well,
even
just
have
be really
unsophisticated
inconvenient and
developers.
difficult to regulate. I mean, what I'd say ultimately is if If it's
We
a-
want it to make, we
right.
want it to,
B.
we want it to be easy to be done.
Right.
I wouldn't say we're necessarily looking to exclude the sophisticated developer who can handle something like that.
Right.
But,
Yeah,
but
but-
we also want it to be, because right now, most subdivisions are being done by the person that owns the land. We want them to cluster it, and we want it to be easy to do.
Right.
And then, so then maybe there is that other.
And
So
it
it's
doesn't-
more likely to be a farmer than
Right.
it is a developer.
Exactly, and it doesn't. And given the history of subdivisions here, it'll take a long period of time for even if it's 3 or 4 parcels to fill out. You know,
Yeah.
so contrast that with the sophisticated developer who's going to have buy-in from 8, 9, 10 people to make the engineering expense alone, just the design expense of the the community septic system plausible, and then the well and the public space and the drafting of just those legal agreements alone is, as well as the design, is a real added cost up front. A developer will do that if they think that they can sell, those 8, 10 parcels over the space of a couple of months, which is the much more typical setting out of here. Like you'd put it on the market, you'd throw the ad in the paper on Saturday, you'd be done a month later, you'd have the money in your bank.
Okay.
It feels to me like, I know you're about to talk, but
Well, I was about to say we're getting too deep in the weeds, because if we do have this talk, it should be when we ratify the language it should be when we have the draft in front of us.
Well, I think
well, this is driving the draft.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it is useful that way.
The problem is,
feel a
I don't
little
think we're going to agree.
Oh, well,
Well,
No, I don't think we're going to agree either.
then how do we make the draft?
Well, I'm saying eventually when we have the draft, we should just vote on it. And I think
I
it
don't,
might...
I don't want something with an up and down vote when we don't have a consensus on what we're doing.
Well, let me just throw this suggestion in there before we continue to talk. If we all agree that we should just go straight yield, I think we should make that decision, but not when Liz is out of the room. But I think that's a really ingenious idea that will save us from a lot of problems down the road.
Straight
Okay.
yield versus what?
Versus minimum lot size. Versus going to a 10-acre minimum in rural and a 3-acre
But
in...
hasn't some of this conversation spilled off of that anyways?
Yes, I'm not saying we should end this conversation. I
Yeah.
just don't want to lose that original
I don't think
Yeah.
we have.
deal that I
I think
thought we all
I think
agreed
that we
on.
need to research it more, and we need
Yeah.
to
Okay.
understand
right.
it
Does any-
better, and that would come
Yeah,
with drafting. But I mean, I think
Does anybody
we
think
can't
that's...
plow too far ahead.
Well, I think we should explore it more. I don't think we're ready to say
Okay.
yes or no to it yet.
Okay, I'm pretty excited about it, but we'll explore more. Now,
We
please,
got that.
don't let me interrupt you, whatever you were going to say. I just didn't want to lose that.
No, that's a good thought,
It's a good
actually.
lawyer trick, huh?
I think it's good input.
Well,
Um,
are you ready to go? Because I've got a question.
Well, I guess
Sorry.
that's quite all right. I mean, I think you said a little bit of what I was thinking, which is, it feels like it feels like we have a concept that we like, which I think is the yield,
Right.
and then we're going into the yield, and then we're regulating more. And I think as a general feeling, we're making a lot of assumptions about, are the farmers good developers? We think that a developer would want a high-end house on the ends and lower. I mean, we're making all these assumptions about what we think the market would want. And I think we should under-regulate and then let the market do what it's going to do as long as it meets whatever other environmental goals we have, versus try to define too much.
I mean, we could also require, when you're subdividing, to be able to show the DRB that there's the capability for septic, well, and whatever else for each lot.
But how does that even, I mean, that goes back to how do you enforce all of this? I mean, who's
You're going to
go-
have to. I mean, if you're not going to have a minimum lot size that you
Or
think that they can, you're going to have to
You
demonstrate.
could have a minimum and
Right.
allow a developer to circumvent that if they could come before the DRB on an appeal and show that they would adequately provide. If a developer's really willing to go out there and, I don't know, perk this, that, and the other.
Well, they do it in lots of other places. They require perk testing. That's not an unusual requirement.
Right, no, I'm just saying maybe give them some way to get out from under that minimum lot size if they can achieve what we're trying to get them to achieve with that sort of broad brush of a regulation. Kind of like the double formula for the yield, or the two methods of calculation.
Would that be determined by defining buildable lot?
I would say,
Yeah.
we'd say to the
Yeah.
developer, this is, I guess, yes.
Well, what if somebody wanted to take one of these lots or whatever and build something like Arbor Hill, which is not an
What's Arbor Hill?
individual house, it's connected, or two buildings with connected units. And
Which one is that?
It's up off of,
Right across from me,
right.
right across from the deli, up off of Rattle Street.
Oh, yeah, all right,
And congregate housing there. Basically condominiums,
yeah.
that or Brookside, not Brookside, Morningside. I mean, that was, I mean, are they hooked up to town water?
Yeah.
So the developer didn't, I mean, he had to come in
Well-
and he did something different there than somebody who's gonna build. I mean, because somebody could want, I mean, maybe this is more suburban, but I just visited, this was in Connecticut, so again, it's very different, but a developer who made some standalone units and also some duplex units and some quads, all on a big piece of land, and that was part of his development, but it was an association.
Right.
Well, it's like that Brattleboro Housing Authority property by Renew.
Well, potentially.
potentially.
No, the one that exists.
Oh,
Oh,
that's
it's not a
not theirs.
BHA one.
That's not?
No,
No. I don't know who owns it, but it's not BHA. It's affordable housing, but it's not a BHA property. I think it's a small Massachusetts-based.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah, it's not. So, yeah, I don't think what we're trying to do is, prevent townhouse, more compact or, sort of the typical sense of a condo or something. And, ironically, I've actually lived in one of those. Probably it would be more, it would be better to characterize where I lived. It was out in upstate New York. It was definitely an old farm field. It was on a state highway, but it was more in keeping, I guess, with kind of the Morningside or Brookside kind of effect, where it wasn't right on the edge of town, but it was on the way out of town. And it was, very specific to that kind of housing market. And it was an interesting experiment in 1970s living, so it had the kind of communal feel.
yeah.
So, I lived on Penny Lane and that intersected Lois Lane, so just to give you the flavor. So,
I'm just thinking that there's some merit in what Jim says, because if there's ever any development around here, it would probably be unconventional. You're not going to have these guys in Virginia who want to do...
right. I don't think what we're proposing necessarily precludes that. So what I would say in an instance like that is, if you're going to build, I can't quite do the math in my head right now, but say you're going to build a group of houses clustered, a group of townhouses, a little bit like one string of Brookside. Well, if you're going to put that on a parcel of land and give them some sense of privacy and landscaping, somewhere to park their car, somewhere to sit outside and, have a cup of coffee or whatever it is, and it's like 8 units long, that parcel's going to run you a couple of acres, straight off the bat. Now, I don't think anything that we've suggested here precludes a developer coming in and saying, so I want to be up off Sunset Lake Road and I'm going to build one of these, and then further up the hill I'm going to have this cluster of 4 regular family homes. How about it? And I think that we'd be like, okay, as long as you're not going to plonk it in the middle of some kind of incredibly rare planting of flowers, you're probably pretty much good to go, as long as it plays out with the requirements that we're giving them. So, I think that what we're sort of, I think this is a useful discussion, because I think what we're trying to do is play out in our heads, what does it actually feel or look like? And I think the reality that you're trying to envisage is doable, and it wouldn't be us dictating what the market was going to do. The reality is if you're going to do it,
Flexibility, aren't
right, you're going
Yeah, I
to
think I
have to
envisage maximum
attend to certain
flexibility.
things.
Because how do we know that the going thing in 10 years isn't going to be a whole different kind of housing,
Right.
because we don't have,
Right.
because the oil thing really happened and blah, 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 blah. I mean, there's already many different kinds of housing communities and little villages or things
Right.
popping up everywhere. And who's to say that people who, a lot of people who live way out want to start, me, the baby boomers, want to come in, but we don't want to be right in town. Maybe some people do because it's more walkable, but some people might just want to be a little further out and,
Or a lot further.
or lots of around.
Yes.
But
It
like,
turns
well,
out.
there's a piece of land I was just thinking about way out Guilford Street as it starts doing its little S turn out there. There's a
Yeah.
piece of land out there
The nice field.
that was, somebody I know was thinking of doing that on, and that was the whole idea, that there's people who, boomers who live way out, who want to still have that country feel,
Yep.
but they don't want to
Sure.
be right in town.
Yeah, that's-
And
I mean-
like- And so,
That's I mean, I think that's, done well. That could be another example of Whetstone Heights, or what it is, right?
Yeah.
That's a field on it's a big field. It's very nice. It's very flat and very buildable. It's
Yeah.
very pretty piece
got
of
some
land.
wetlands in there, but,
Right. And it's-
and leave some open space so the people
Right.
can garden or do whatever they want. But yeah, and there might be other little chunks, like the Whetstone Heights one in town. I don't know where they are, but there might be, probably not very many.
I'm kind of astounded that they're giving me
I
other
know,
options,
I
but
know,
yeah, it's okay.
I know. But,
It was tough. I would imagine it was really tough.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of just defining a buildable lot.
Mhm.
I mean, that may change in the future. Say we all have to have solar or something.
Sure.
Well, that can change that. But
well, septic can too.
as I think about this, kind of something that Sir Salsimon is known for, and I hate to throw him under the bus, but he'll buy like 50 acres of land, and we have to put up 10 houses on it. Well, he'll build Whetstone Heights, and guess what the rest of the land becomes? His tree lot.
Right.
I mean, he'll just have anyone who's into lumber buying up tracts of land just so they can cut stuff down.
Well, as long as they
How
do
do we
good
avoid
forestry,
that?
then that's all.
Well, it's-
In that instance, I mean, if they came up with a forestry plan that conformed to the expectations, I think that would be fine. I mean,
That would be under the I mean, that's
Right.
the kind of thing.
Yeah.
we're
and it would be
looking for in
conserved land. I mean,
conservation
actually, in
is-
some ways, that would be fine. It might not quite work out the way
yeah.
they traditionally.
But it's not
viewed it.
that different from a farmer,
Right.
Oh, yeah.
you know, because they're
That's true.
both resource-based
Right.
Oh, yeah, I was
industries that
gonna-
want to.
I was going to soften the blow a little bit.
Yeah.
My company could go out and buy a huge tract of land and just put a bunch of tanks under the ground. Develop 10 houses.
I don't want to interrupt. We
Yeah,
didn't. We
sorry.
didn't. We didn't have public comment, and I think James has been trying to raise his hand there in the audience. Is that right?
Kind of. I was just looking through this and I found a typo.
Oh,
No. Oh, no.
Do you want time to go to through the whole thing, James?
Just section 3.6, utilities. Under A location, one old utility system.
Yep,
You see where it says fiber optic?
yep.
Should be optical fibers. There is no such thing as fiber optics. That's impossible.
Anyway,
Thanks, James. That's good.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fiber, and then optics, or optical fibers.
You're giving no credit to common usage, though.
yeah, that's what I was.
You're right, James. I'm wrong.
No, no.
Wrong number one is right. James number 2.
You're technically right, but common usage does it the other way.
Either way.
I thought you wanted it worded for legal reasons or whatever.
I might prefer your way around.
I just think, I agree that, I think this conversation is useful, I think. We're batting around a lot of things, and I think, I mean, I don't know what the exact answer is, but I like to just leave, I think we're on the right idea when we're talking conservation, subdivision, but we have to, I mean, I just want there to be space in there for the person who comes along and wants to create something really different.
Yep.
Wouldn't you
Like, if
accomplish
there's
that
somebody
with
like-
a
I'm just
minimum
gonna
and
make something
exception?
up. There's two builders who have a building company, they've had it for 20, 30 years, they're known around here, and they both live out, and let's say all of a sudden they want to move them and their families in, they're all grandkids now, but they themselves, they and their wives want to move closer in, but they want to do it and build a little community, and maybe they want to do cutting-edge stuff, like put in solar, maybe have a gray water system. I mean, of course, then you're banking up against the state stuff, but, or whatever kind of thing they want to put in, I wouldn't want to prohibit somebody like that with a little more
Well,
out of the box.
Yeah, I don't.
It's like a family
creativity.
compound. There's a lot of that around here, you know. You
Yeah.
have a
I mean,
Well, yeah, but they want to probably sell some units,
Big
kind of.
club.
Dallas.
No, but it's a good point, because I mean, imagine if you had a larger development and you put like a giant mound system in and covered it with solar panels, and it was taking up almost all of your development envelope. So you really had to put your house in
Does
a little
solar have to
tchotchke.
be in the development envelope?
I would think so.
Not necessarily. It probably would be. There's a practical consideration too, which happens. It's if you look at where people put solar panels, the one on Western Ave might be the exception. But if you think about it for a little while, that's actually very close to the road, and they're selling it onto the grid. So it's not to service the building in back. It's just for sale. The
And they make
amount of electricity that the panel generates, when you feed it down a wire, copper wire, you lose power for every inch of wire. So if you're trying to power your house with it, or your car, or whatever else it is, or you're trying to sell it, the shorter the distance between the panel and where it ultimately needs to go is better, because you've got this loss factor. So reality, that's why people put solar panels on the roof of their house, because it's right, or it's a structure that's already there, and if it's strong enough to support the weight of the panel, then it's.
Wanted to do a huge system. Specifically, a lot of farms are doing that now, where they're.
Well, that's a different. Like the one. So yeah, there's plenty, both to the south and to the north of us, where it's just a field given over to solar panels. So it's a solar farm. It's a very, very, very different operation economically, and that actually. It's not immediately apparent to the passerby, but that's actually hooking onto the grid kind of a fair way up the hierarchy. So they actually need to be able to, because they're selling so much power onto the grid. So the wires going past have to be big enough to accept that amount of electricity generated.
But the solar panels don't work unless they're facing south. So what if the only place that you have south facing, maybe it's even on a steep slope? What if the only place you have on your site is
Well,
not?
you can do trackers. They just follow the sun.
Yeah.
Or the light.
I mean, there's
Well,
options.
I'm just saying, them being included in that building envelope thing that we're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
you're saying that they shouldn't, in the buildable area of the lot, that you'd want them to be allowed outside? Because that's not a problem either.
Well, I guess so, just because if that building envelope may be great for building, construction, foundations, whatever, but it might not have anything suitable for solar. So that was my question.
What I'd say there is that the building envelopes that we're envisaging are pretty spacious. So it's bigger. It's significantly bigger than one regular, average home size circle, right? And so if you clear it, regardless of its orientation, even if you clear it, unless it's a very steep slope and it's facing entirely to the north,
Yeah, but
you should be able to find some level of solar radiation. I mean,
that's not necessarily true, because if you have 20 acres and you want to put a house on it and your building envelope is 1 acre, I think that's what we talked about last time. Put it close to the road, fine, whatever. But then if none of that area lends itself to solar.
Well, that's the old way of doing it, put it close to the road, and I think a lot of more cutting-edge people are doing is looking at the orientation of the sun when they build a development, and I think when we're talking about conservation easement, that's a piece, at least for me, when I think of that. I don't even know if it's one of the categories in here, but that we think about is orientation, geographical orientation, so that when they do a conservation easement, you place your houses in a way. I mean, builders of old would just throw their roads up their grid or whatever to get as many houses on a piece of land as they wanted. And I would think it would be somehow, I don't know how to do this, but, and if we have it in here that
Plenty of developers
you can allow for that
still
kind
do
of
that.
thing within.
Is the question Will renewable energy sources be allowed to be built outside of the building envelopes? Is that the question
Yeah.
that you're trying to get
There
at?
it is, there you go.
Yeah.
You got it.
Well, I think that,
Right. I mean, it's a good question.
I think it's a good question, and I think it's something we need to consider, because it
It's a
seems
hard
like it's,
question.
Well, doesn't
really,
that question, wasn't that question already answered in the rest of the zoning? I mean, aren't there solar panels on people's roofs and yards that are already
Well, it's-
occurring in town?
but
And
those
it's
aren't
outside of the
conservation
scope
areas.
of our zoning.
yeah, that's what I
Actually,
was going to say. I
there
mean,
is a
it's kind of
technical
outside
aspect to
of our
this,
control.
which is if it, basically a household system up to 10 kilowatts, we're not even going to see the application, basically.
We get
Yeah,
noticed,
but I'm
that's it.
on a bigger, if somebody's doing a real
Right.
development, and they're like, hey, look at this green co-housing little commune here. I mean, it's more efficient to cluster these, rather than having them be individual per house. I mean, from a developer, whatever.
Yeah.
But if there is a section of land that would lend itself to solar,
Even
I
if it's
think we
close
can
by
write
the
that.
houses, but outside the building envelope, right?
Right.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
if it's, you know,
I mean, it's kind of, it's
100
no
feet away, but
different than
that's
a
outside
community
the building.
septic system. You're talking about a community solar system
That's
right.
for the,
Right.
for the
So
development.
whether
one
it's in-
sits above ground and the other
Right.
sits below ground. So
I-
I think it just needs to be identified how we're going to deal with it.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think it's sort of, I don't have a big issue with it being outside the building envelope. I mean, you might want to see the developer, justify that location as part of the plan relative to, again, some other set of established natural attributes. So in other words,
Are you
as long as
talking
it's
about
not
the conservation area, though? Because that's what I think she's talking about.
Yeah.
well, I'm talking about either or. I mean, if you're
I'm
subdividing.
okay with it in the conservation zone.
What
Yeah.
if it's just with an eye towards environmental impact?
right.
I mean,
I don't care either personally whether it's in the conservation area, as long as you're not pouring concrete on top of some nesting area. I mean,
Or
you
you're
just
not
need
in the floodplain, or you're
you're not in the floodplain. Yeah, there's a whole series of other things that we might want to check it against. So it's not carte blanche, but it's like, yeah, sure, okay.
Yeah, we just have to write that in the open space area, that you could
Right.
locate a community.
I might add,
I hate to be a stick in the mud, but I don't agree. I think conservation ought to be conserved from everything.
Then that means houses too.
Right.
yeah,
No, I mean, that's the whole point
Yeah, that's the whole
here.
point.
No,
having-
yeah, I see where Jane is coming from.
Well, I think we should use,
It's kind of like,
we
I
should
mean,
call it
God
But
forbid
open
bring this
space.
up, but
That's the
open
public
space as
good
opposed to,
that
and then it's
comes
how you're going
from
to.
the clustering.
Well,
yeah,
Yes.
and that's
a lot of
why.
public good comes from renewable energy too. And I'm just playing devil's advocate. I
I
totally
understand.
see both sides. It's-
Yeah.
That's why I think it's such a hard issue, and that's why I think people should have exceptions to a minimum lot size, so it would allow you to put a huge field of solar in the developable if you wanted to, I don't know, cluster it right around the field, say,
Can I ask a
on these
question?
tiny lots.
Sure.
Can I ask a question about minimum lot size? So when I'm thinking about the lay of the land around here, and when somebody comes in and says, all right, I'm going to put 10 houses on this, or subdivide, or whatever they're going to do, is there a method of making sure that your parcels aren't hodgepodge? And by that I mean,
I think we should write that into the ordinance. I think that's great.
I did, I took
No,
care of
Yeah,
it.
you got, yeah, she does actually. She says here, no hodgepodging.
well, and I say that because as
Yeah,
soon as
also
we
love it.
start putting a minimum lot size on, I feel like if somebody's going to subdivide, the parcels could start just to achieve that minimum lot size. They're going to start going all over the place and like cutting in the back of this one and whatever it is,
Yeah.
and that
I
doesn't
think-
sound like good development.
I think if
It's-
read properly, you could not interpret these regulations that way.
Right.
There's, so on page, I didn't put page numbers, I'm sorry. Section 3.2B, so on the second page of the regs, do you need them?
Lot layout.
Over there. It basically says side lot lines shall be at right angles to straight roads or radial to curved roads. lots with irregular shapes, curves, jogs, doglegs, etc., shall not be created unless warranted by conditions of topography, the location of environmental resources, or existing roads. So I think, to me, that's clear. We don't want weird shapes. We don't want little cut-ins and bump outs and this and that, unless you've got a reason for the topography.
And having a minimum lot size, what do we achieve with that? What is making sure that people get their septic and their building envelope and all this stuff in one lot? That's the goal with that.
For me, I need to think this through, but having, if we go back to, are we going back to in the rural, there would be no minimum lot size? It would be based on, for me, having a minimum lot size controls the density. And so, say you've got 100-acre piece of land, 80 acres are open space, you've got 20 acres left. You could have 5, house sites clustered. You could have 10, you could have 20, you could have 40. What I'm saying is, in the rural area, 40, in my mind, does not fit the development pattern out there or what we want to see given...
But do we have to use lot size to regulate the number of houses?
Well, it's got to be regulated somehow.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean we need to use lot size.
There's two purposes, I think, for lot sizes. One is the protection of the property owner, that it's not too small to be adequate,
Right.
and to actually build a house on it. And I know people are building little tiny houses now, but there is, it's part and parcel of the purposes of zoning. Light, air, open space, an adequate parcel of land to put a house on. And the second thing is the integrity of the zoning district, in that you want to have a minimum size lot in the rural or the rural residential, really because we're differentiating different uses for different zones. So if this is the country, then it's going to have a different minimum lot size than the city part. And
Vice versa.
that's the land use plan that we're all working under, and it's not a hodgepodge. It's each zone has meaning.
So could I take a parcel of land and put 9 row houses if I own them all? Or is that considered multifamily? How does that work?
Well, that's not subdivision.
But if you had a parcel of land,
Yeah.
and let's say I own that parcel of land and I
Yeah.
build 9 row houses.
Well,
and
that's what we're talking
then they're
about.
all
I mean,
rentals.
I would
One
rather,
building that's a row house.
I would rather not have that type of development in the rural and the rural residential zones.
Right.
But
They don't
that's
go.
sort of a matter of
Well,
opinion.
now
though,
you're
isn't it?
talking about like anti-zoning sentiments that say everything should be allowed
Everywhere.
everywhere.
I think that is a huge jump to say that that's what Kimberly is saying.
Well, that's leading. Well, it is if you want to
Yeah,
put
so
a bunch of row
put the
houses.
line? Where do we put the line between we have to protect that homeowner from doing the wrong thing to where we give appropriate freedoms to let the market do what it needs to do, so that in 10 years, if some new technology comes up or something else comes up, that the flexibility exists?
Well, that flexibility has to be tailored to the needs of the land uses in the zones, which is what we've just spent 3 years working on, is the land use plan.
Well, I think Timberley's just trying to make a point by showing the logical extreme of something, not to suggest that,
Well, but like an elderly housing development.
right.
If I were old and gray and wanted a nice view and quaint blah blah blah.
Well, I am old and gray.
And she has a very quaint view, I have to
And if I
say.
wanted a quaint view, but I wanted to make sure that I'm around other people, I would want a cute little shipping container house, on a small piece of land. Maybe I don't own it, maybe I'm renting it, but that's where the argument of, because when I'm hearing this, it sounds like we're talking about specifically single family on 5 acres or something.
Or a half acre.
Or a half acre, and I'm just,
That's
And
what
I know when
Right, and
I'm
so-
old and gray, I don't want to cut a half acre.
But
Well,
I don't want to cut a half acre now.
so I chose, in my old and gray years, to live in the eastern half of the town, where I can walk into downtown and so forth. I
Maybe you
wouldn't.
can't afford it. I mean, it's expensive as shit to live down here. So if you have somebody doing something small and
but now you're buying into that whole select board argument that it's cheaper to buy some sort of postage stamp out in the rural area and cut down your own log home. That's not practical either.
And that's not what she's saying.
Yeah, but if you take it to its logical extreme, you really have to have an understanding of this zone is going to have this type of house, and this zone is going to have, this type of development. And there can be a mixture, but the full range of housing types is, for high density, would be in the downtown or downtown fringe
But
areas.
if you're building a cluster, you're going to have high density in the cluster, and why can't? I mean, I don't see where that fits into what you're saying.
Well, because the little old gray-haired lady in the rural zone wouldn't live anywhere near any of the services and things that.
Well, maybe she doesn't care, because she's got neighbors who do all that for her. I mean, when I gave my example of different kinds of housing, some single, some attached, some duplexes, some fourplexes, I want to know that somebody could do that, say, out on Guilford Street, or up off of Orchard Street.
Well, Guilford Street's not. I think that
That's
part.
rural residential.
That's rural residential, and so given the yield, if they're going to do a conservation subdivision, they can achieve one unit per 1.5 acres. It's probably, I don't know, like a 6-acre parcel. So I think it's conceivable. I mean, what I'm going to try and do here is just sort of straighten out all the spaghetti strands so that it's not like all tangled together here. I'd say these things follow from this discussion. One is that parcel that you're thinking of on Guilford Street, which is now a substantially built-up semi-suburban neighborhood with some significant parcels left, might come out of this process, and we might reconsider whether it's appropriately zoned or not. Right? So that would be one discussion. So.
It's rural residential now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. But you could make it
residential.
You could make it residential.
Want to look where it is?
got it.
Right. It's
Guilford Street goes up,
both-
up and it goes chunk.
both. Assuming that Guilford Street runs south to Guilford,
Sometimes it does.
sometimes it does. Both to the north and the south of that parcel, and certainly over the road.
Yeah.
I would represent that neighborhood as made up of freestanding single-family dwellings on at that point, relatively comfortable parcels in the 2 to 3 acre size, right? So there's that question: is it appropriately zoned? If you conclude that it is appropriately zoned, and you have an innovative, thoughtful, obviously wealthy developer who's willing to take a huge risk, and part of what they're proposing is a combination of multi-unit housing complexes in combination with other forms of housing, assuming that that's what's going to make it work from a marketing and a physical standpoint, then the comment that I made before that, okay, so one of those parcels is 2 acres or whatever it is, which is adequate for a shared septic and some some limited private yard space for each one of those housing units and it could be a row house or however you describe it. That could be appropriate, and we would be offering them the tools of not just a conservation subdivision, but under those circumstances they'd be employing something like a planned residential development, right? So it could be age specific, it could be community specific, it could be a strong play to attract certain kinds of people to that kind of housing. It could have some kind of physical feature that everyone wanted to take advantage of and were willing to live close together to do. That could be anything from a vista or a far off view to that's the closest thing to the bus stop, right? So, and the Stevens and Associates proposed development, the sort of schematics for the development of the parcel uphill from the Brookside condominiums now incorporated that kind of variety of uses, right? So that happens to be rural residential there, right?
No, it's residential.
It's residential, so it worked. Okay? But what I'd say is, you take rural or rural residential and you combine it with PRD and a conservation subdivision,
okay.
and then, well, I mean, we're talking about sophisticated developers who can read all the way through the zoning ordinance without falling asleep. So, you know, that's
So you
not that.
Combine a PRD
Right.
with
So
the conservation.
that's not inconceivable. But what we're holding on to here is some other kind of, if you like, minimum or base, you know, minimum standard or basic delivery that does certain things. It protects both sides of the transaction, the seller and the buyer. It facilitates easy permitting by the state, and because in that example, we would not be the one that's issuing septic permits or even permits for solar or alternative energy, renewable energy. And so it also provides these other minimal protections and streamlines the whole process. So if you are Farmer Joan and you just want to do it, and you don't want to become a developer to do it, there is this tool that we'll offer you that's pretty self-explanatory and straightforward that allows you to do it without going the PRD route. Okay? And so what we're sort of mushing all together here is all sorts of different projects with all sorts of different ends, with all sorts of different expectations. And if you could just run the spaghetti strands out so that they sort of stay in a straight line and think about what are we really talking about. This one is one kind of project and this one is another kind of project. Some of what we've been talking about here goes to the question of zoning. Some of it goes to the question of how we're going to write the subdivision standards. Some of it goes to the question of what things do you combine together? What do you stack together to make your project work? And clearly in the hands of Stevens and Associates and Jonathan Chase, one big, large property owner, they were perfectly happy to operate the planned residential development requirements of the zoning code to think about a conceptual plan approval for a 67-acre parcel, most of which was actually going to be occupied by relatively untouched open space, so a wooded hillside, right? So remember that each time you're thinking about some kind of a project, the same entity or the same person is not going to be wanting to do all these things for obvious reasons to do with resources and ability. And I think in the end, I share Sue's concern, which is at a very broad sort of like Google Earth level, we are making a commitment to have the 2/3 to the west of town remain rural and rural residential in character, and we mean to do that in a very specific way, which doesn't preclude planned residential developments as long as they're located on adequately maintained roads, relatively close to services. So, it would be Ames Hill Brook or maybe Bonnie Vale fairly close to Route 9, or Pleasant Valley Road, just up past the Chelsea Royal, but not 10 miles out, right? Because you start getting into other questions about whether that's appropriate for the zoning district, which is now you've got maybe 80 residents in a totally isolated location, and they're cut off from Route 9 because the bridge has gone out, and you're going to have to go get them now. All right, so there ultimately are these sorts of decisions that we are expecting to make in the subdivision regulations and the zoning ordinance that kind of cluster people in appropriate places for a whole set of complicated reasons, none the least of which is those people that have already decided to be there have some basic expectations about what they want to encounter, and it may not be 80 screaming people just over the fence. So, and we have to get the zoning ordinance and the subdivision regulations through this very small hole of these 5 people, okay, and to the other side. So we have to acknowledge that that's going to be a reasonable reaction to what we're proposing to do.
Yeah, I just like to go on the record and say I'm a little worried about over-regulation on this. And I'm not, like Carolina said, and I'm not sure, maybe I don't totally understand everything yet, but I just wonder if we're sort of limiting or I don't know.
Do you think what you see here, I mean, if we can bring it back to the draft, because I don't want to talk about over-regulating conservation subdivisions when we don't have a draft in front of us, and I haven't even explored some of the things that we've talked about. And this is actually something I'm interested in from all planning commissioners' What is your thought on this? Does this feel like over-regulation? I know you seem concerned about building envelopes. I mean, what else?
Everything I've heard about big things we want to make sure we do correctly, like Rod just stated, which I think were great, none of them required a specific building envelope size. And I agree with Timberly in general on overregulation, and in particular on the building envelope piece of it. That it just, all these things can be accomplished without regulating that. And when we do regulate that, we all of a sudden start limiting lots of other options that could come in. So, no, you asked Timberly.
No, I was asking everybody.
Well, I'm trying to think, during our last conversation, we were talking about the building envelope rule with the pros and, I should have wrote a pros and cons list.
I remember what you
Right.
said. If it's helpful.
Could you remind me?
Yeah, you were worried that if the
Complicated
seller is the
for
one who's
buyer.
designating the building envelope, you stymie the buyer's creativity, basically.
Yeah.
That's been your concern with it.
That's why I remember. Yeah.
And that makes a little bit of sense.
And I was saying I just wanted there to be some remedy for someone who wants to buy a lot if they can find another building envelope that would otherwise satisfy the regulations to be able to change the thing.
Right, and the resolution to that is to go back and modify the plat.
And they would have to get site plan approval for whatever they're doing anyway?
No,
So they
you would just have to go back as a minor subdivision, designate a new building envelope on the.
And you could just go to the zoning administrator for that, right?
No, because it's changing the subdivision plat.
Oh.
So by statute, it needs to go in the land use records.
And
That's
that's to
what
go,
you're trying to avoid, right? A little bit. So-
And if there's no way to avoid it,
We're
there's
talking
no way to
concerns about
avoid it.
building envelopes.
If there's a state statute.
Okay. As in, what are the concerns about building envelopes? They're too big, too small?
No, the same thing I
Having
brought up
nothing
last time,
existing.
and Timberly as well, that you might prejudice a buyer if the buyer doesn't have a remedy. You know, if the buyer wants their house in a place that would otherwise be fine, why should they be prejudiced because a careless seller just sort of picked the easiest or the first building
So
envelope they could
we have a
pick?
mechanism for them changing the building envelope?
Yes.
That, I don't see the connection between that and the minimum lot size.
I was just, I made
I
a
don't
broad.
think there is. I think the
Okay.
subject changed.
Yeah,
I think.
I just
I just
are you
missed
mad
that.
at me, Liz? I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
I was just reminding her what, because Jim brought up the building envelope, and I remembered what Timberly said about it.
Okay, I just thought there was a connection there that I was
No,
missing, and
no,
I'm
no.
happy to know that we changed the subject.
We do have, though, in here, though, we do have areas of clearing for the building envelopes. So kind of somewhat related.
And what the conversation we were having earlier about renewable energy being within the building envelope,
Right.
or that's still up for debate? Or do you have a decision on that?
Well, I think it seemed like everybody didn't feel, well, no.
No, building envelope or not building envelope, I don't really care. If it's in the conservation area, I don't think I personally don't think that there should be exceptions when you're in the conserved area. But as far as
And I see James's point of
as
view.
far as being outside the building envelope, I have much less strong feelings.
So the sentence that says, "The size and shape of the building envelope shall reflect zoning district setback requirements and citing limitations in accordance with the zoning regs," you're okay with that?
So I just want to,
Doesn't bother me.
I want to be clear that that the Article 3 that you're looking at is the standards for a conventional subdivision,
Yeah.
not
Right.
for a conservation. So that's why
Yeah.
it says it's got to meet the setbacks
Yeah,
and
okay.
this and that. And the reason we looked at building envelopes was it was a way to have the particular parcel treated, to look at the natural resources on it and to pay greater attention to them.
Right.
By identifying some of these areas and not having the building envelope.
And I should say at that point, I guess it was my expectation that the argument that the applicant would be making for the particular building envelope that they're showing is that it's going to offer them the maximum possible access to solar gain, for instance, right? Because, just hang on a second, because the expectation or the hope would be that they would be interested in at least two things: passive solar gain for the structure, and that would automatically mean that you have access to solar radiation for the solar panels, if they also wanted to use that as an energy generation source. So the building envelope concept is expressly designed to actually have the developer reflect on the shape of the parcel and then the proposed area of development on the parcel with regard to alternative energy.
Does Act 250 have rules in place for any of the stuff we're already talking about? I mean, are we duplicating anything?
No. Act 250 is in effect for developments of 10 units or more, or 10 acres or more of disturbance. So if you're under that, it's not in effect.
What about things like a wind turbine?
Act 250 doesn't regulate wind turbines. That's Act 248. And
Well,
if it's...
It might next year.
I'm not holding my breath. What I'd say there is...
Still in the legislature. Sorry.
Yeah.
I asked because of site disturbance.
A windmill of a commercial, I mean, you know, what we have to distinguish between here is a sort of a residential scale windmill or a kind of a farmstead size windmill, which is still covered by Act 248 with regard to the design of the tower and how it is secured. And you have to make provision, basically, if you can imagine that, well, for it to be viable and from an energy gaining standpoint, it has to be more than 250 feet in the air. So then, if this pen is 250 feet tall and I've got my windmill on top of it, I have to allow for it falling down anywhere within a zone of 250. It has to have a radius of 250 feet cleared area. And then it also has to be high enough so that there's no other obstacle blocking the wind that gets to it, otherwise it's pointless. It won't go around. So once you take those factors into account, you'll actually establish that there are not very many windmills in Vermont of a small scale. That radius is a requirement of its establishment under Act 248. And so you couldn't, for instance, if this is the fence line of your neighbor, you couldn't put it here and risk having it fall on your neighbor. You couldn't put it here and risk having it fall on your house. There's just certain things that they're just not going to let you do. 250 feet radius is a pretty big area.
So for a residential scale windmill, are we talking about, or
Yeah.
250 feet in the air for a residential?
No, they're usually around 100, I thought.
I think actually it might be less than that. For a residential one, you could get it at 100. You don't get effective wind speed until about 200 feet in the air. So
I mean, that's a Vermont thing, though. I mean, if you're somewhere,
yeah, if you're in the middle of nowhere, like if you're in the middle of Indiana,
No, even in New Jersey, they're high and they got to fall down, and
Right.
you have to have that
a radius
same
that's
amount of
cleared, and
clearance.
it means that they're able to fall down and not injure or hurt anybody else, including, at the point where it falls down, the blades actually have a little life of their own for a while and go further. So, the decapitation issue kind of, it gets the attention of people pretty quickly, for obvious reasons. So,
These things have fallen down before?
of course, everything that gets put up falls down. Bridges, buildings,
They
windmills.
have a very deep foundation,
Yeah.
but,
Or guy ropes. I mean, and plus it's windy, so they're getting blown down.
the pressure.
There's YouTubes of it. It's really
Yeah.
cool.
Really?
James, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, what if you put a windmill in the middle of the Connecticut River?
That would
It's a
actually
New
be
Hampshire
really
problem.
good, but it would be you got. Yeah, I recommend you contact New Hampshire about that. I'm sure they'll be open to your inquiry.
I think for me,
They
I
own the
realize that
river.
these are just the regular subdivision regs, and then we were also talking about conservation.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we're kind of,
Yes,
Yeah,
we've
we-
shifted
I
gears.
could keep it separate.
Can we have like a bird's eye view of, we're looking at this, then there's a subdivision. There's also the changes that you guys talked about at breakfast with the EPA people.
Yeah, but that I haven't even researched
Right.
it.
Yes, so.
That kicked
this
off
is
the whole discussion.
a
I'm kicking
piece,
myself now.
This is just the standard subdivision.
yeah.
Yeah, so
Piece of
Article
the
3 is
puzzle.
the standard subdivision piece. It would apply to any subdivision, or it gives you kind of the design guidelines. So how are you going to handle roads? If you're going to have open space, what does that look like? How are the lots laid out? Discussion of building envelopes and where they should be located. What else? Utilities and other easements.
And they might be a reference, even if you're having a conservation
Yes,
subdivision.
even with
Yes.
the conservation,
You
it's going to tie back
revert
to
the
some things.
utilities and so forth.
Yeah,
Yep.
some things will tie back to here.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe for the next meeting, I can get you
Yeah.
a more complete
I
document.
guess I was mixing it all up, so, thank you for,
I have a question of definition. When we use the term building envelope, are we talking about the total square footage or acreage that a building will go on? Because the other thought of a building envelope, of course, is the actual
Yeah.
walls that,
Yeah.
so it's the
Um,
total acreage that a building will sit on.
It's, within the lot,
Square
it's the cleared area
Yeah.
that, the development will take place. So all your structure, your accessory structures, parking.
So
It's an area where you can build a building.
I got it.
if this
Okay,
so
I
doesn't
got
have
it, I
parcel,
know.
I mean, it doesn't have to be
then
clear,
that's,
though.
that's the driveway.
No, it doesn't.
I get
But
it.
it can also be your limits of
That's
clearing
the
on the
building.
lot.
Oh, I thought we said they're only going to be square.
Yeah, they're only square round.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
He's
This
still-
is actually,
Thank
believe it
you.
or not, this is a square instead of an ancient
Thank
Greek
you.
square. Okay.
He's stuck on the
Square to
circles.
circle.
Square peg in a round hole.
Because we want it easy for people to describe the corners of.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Which is tricky with a circle. All right.
You and your circles.
It's just a natural thing.
Okay, let's put conservation to bed for a little while and
Yep.
talk about
Yeah.
Article 3 while we're here before we all get tired.
Oh, too late.
Those of us with the gray hair.
I myself thought it was quite good and had really nothing to add.
What are we looking at?
This Article 3. Do you want mine?
The whole thing.
Sue's made comments
Do I have
on the
it?
far.
Oh, you
Yeah,
found my
take
bars. I have extra PowerPoint slides from the EPA presentation, if you would like to see it. Mark got them. No, those were the EPA slides. You'll see examples of conservation subdivision. Did you get one, Kimberly?
Their example looks terrible to me.
Yes, I agree.
I thought so too.
That was like the last thing I thought anyone from Brattleboro would ever want.
Yeah, we have to find a better sketch, that's for sure.
The sketches were okay. It was the actual pictures.
Yeah, right.
Look at this thing. Good God.
They got that whole SimCity thing going. It's perfectly flat. It's just nice short grass with big, oversized kind of McMansion-y things in the corners of it. It was a little odd.
This actually looks
It
like a
sort of makes you
development
realize
key.
that sometimes our challenging
Wall.
topography is our best friend when it comes to things looking nice. You know?
It hides a lot of junk. You're right.
Did you want-
Hides a lot of junk and it forces people to
This
build
was
in
longer
one
than the
place.
morning.
And
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
once in a while, it washes away.
Yeah, that's right. It's God's way of telling you that you've got too much mess.
I keep hitting this. I'm sorry.
That's fine, I just bought them at the hardware store for $1.49.
I don't feel so bad.
Does anybody
Get away.
have anything else on Article 3? I mean, I'm kind of farting around here.
I just had a question, section C. Do we want to establish a minimum?
Section,
Three.
3-2C.
Oh, okay. Oh, of the building envelope. You're saying, do you want, where 3.2C2
Yeah.
says that there's a maximum.
It gives
Right.
a maximum.
Oh,
do you want? So you're saying, do we want to establish a minimum? Is that your question?
Just put the question out there.
and the greater question from earlier is, do we even want to have building envelopes?
I initially didn't like the idea, but you guys persuaded me that it was that it had merit. I think realistically, anyone is going to always do a maximum-sized building envelope, just because it'll. give
It gives
more
them
value
flexibility.
if you're the seller of a lot.
Right. So they're generously enough proportions so that you could locate a house within the square in multiple different locations. Right.
I mean,
I
it's just
think
a
there's two
straight
questions on the table. Do we want them, and then how big should they be, if we want them?
I'm content that they're valuable as long as the buyer can change it, and that as long as they have straight sides, it seems to make sense. I think a minimum is not a bad idea, but
Can you have more than one building envelope? Like, can you have a half acre here and a half acre there? Or does it have to be connected? Or does that defeat the whole purpose?
Well, I'm wondering if, you got a maximum here. If I just do all cabins in my 10-acre parcel, I get a huge yield. I don't know if we establish a minimum, if that scares people away.
Well,
I mean, if we have a maximum.
Are we talking about the lots? Are we talking about the building envelope or the number of buildings that go on a specific number of acres? Because again, you can't build, whether the cabins are tiny or whether they're a bunch of big houses, we've still got a half-acre lot size, if that's the number we chose, or whatever
this
the
is-
lot size
I think we might be
This
talking
is-
about two
Two
different
different
things.
things.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
you're talking about the envelope where you can build on a conservation easement, right? Or a conservation subdivision, right or wrong?
No, just
Just the standard part of the ordinance,
Never mind, in that case I misunderstood.
3C2. But I think what we're saying here, or what we're trying to figure out is it one envelope per building? Or, when I say building, I should say immediately main structure. So does the building envelope represent one house site and some accessory structures like a garage or a barn? Or are we talking about a building envelope for multiple main structures?
Oh,
And I think the answer is it provides for one main structure, like one dwelling unit, and some accessory structures.
Oh, okay. I thought last time we said that outbuildings could be outside of it, sheds
No.
and such.
No.
No.
You can't build a
Is
shed
that pretty
outside the
standard?
building.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You couldn't build a shed outside of it. The way it's written now. Or the intent of it.
The intent of it right now is to make sure that the shed is included. I mean, to all intents and purposes, it would be a little odd. I mean, if you're going to take 10 acres of wooded land and then you're going to clear 2 acres for your house, barn, and shed site, and then you perversely want to go off into the woods and build a shed, then
I'm thinking more of a farm where you want something on the other side of the field.
What
for
we
whatever
could
reason.
do is it could be written to say, I'd have to check the zoning the way that it's defined now, but the individual building, or the home, whatever the right word is, and accessory buildings as opposed to is there a difference
I
between
think
building and
building and
structure?
structure.
So that
fair,
would
I think
actually
of
get
it as
at
a sugar house.
like a
Yeah.
right, because that's
Okay.
not, you couldn't live in it,
Well,
so that
actually-
could be.
It's got to be.
that's
near the-
that's protected.
it's gotta be
That's
near the
protected
street.
under state statute. So relax. So we have
But
to
like
do,
a stable, if you wanted a stable somewhere on the edge of a clearing, or if
Right,
you,
yes.
or back to your solar panels, those are more of a structure. They're not
a
they're not
building,
buildings that you live in, or.
right?
But then, how do you do the garage thing? So I get.
Well, a sugar house or something used for agricultural purposes, greenhouses, sugar houses, and barns are all protected under state statute if you're engaged in farming.
If you're
Protected in
You're still supposed to meet zoning, though.
For setback requirements.
Yeah.
protected how?
For what?
You can just build them.
You
can
just
just
need to
build them.
notify the town that
Like
you're doing
as
it.
of right?
Yeah, you
Just
need
build
to
them?
notify the town that you're doing it.
That you've done it, actually.
And you're supposed to attempt to meet.
And it does, you've done it, like setbacks.
I've done it. Right.
What's,
Right.
Yeah, I didn't mean to drive us.
Thank you so much,
No, I
Mark.
think it's a
Because
good
it's
point,
a good
though.
point.
I just always envision the building envelope as where you put the residence.
Right, I think that's what we do mean for the most part. But under your scenario, now we're encountering, like I said, somebody who's thinking about something else.
I mean, I just know people like to build weird outbuildings in rural areas. I don't know what they're for most of the time, but they're out there.
Separation of
my
spouses,
neighbors.
usually.
same reason people go ice fishing.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's building outside the envelope.
That's right. It's just an age-old ritual of old grey-haired people trying to spend time apart. So.
Well, should
So
we be hurt by the
I am now confused. I am now confused. I've become more
Oh, I
instead of less
understand that. It makes
confused.
a lot of sense to me.
So these subdivision and PUD standards, these are not about the conservation subdivisions, or are they?
No, no,
You're right.
no, they're not.
So conservation subdivision is going to be a whole different thing.
Yes.
A whole nother
Yes.
article. This is Article
Right.
3, conservation is what?
Yeah.
Four.
Yeah.
There will be
Which
some.
there has been
So
a
this is the
conservation
more
draft circulating,
traditional
but
Yeah, they-
subdivision.
There will be some links
more
They
back.
were
traditional
originally
terms
together.
and
and
definitions.
We split them out.
but the previous conversation is not for naught.
I understand. Yes, I get it.
What
Yeah.
about clear cutting land? I
People
like
love
having
it.
this conversation.
That came up actually.
Right, it
If
did.
you're not logging or farming, can you clear cut outside your building envelope?
No,
No,
that's what this is saying. Is no,
right. That's the
Really?
yeah. That's the definition of the envelope.
including
So your
limits of
maximum
clearing.
field
it says.
size is one. I'm not even looking at the right thing.
If you're engaged in farming, if I have a giant
Sorry.
garden, does that make me a farmer?
You have to
No.
sell a certain
You have
amount
to
No,
of
you have
hours
to
a
sell.
year.
You have
If
to
you-
meet
if
the
you sell
minimum
It's like 1,000. or something.
IRS requirement to declare that farming is one of your sources of income, which is about $1,000 a year,
So you're saying the maximum,
which is about
clearing-
600 eggs.
clearing space would be a half acre?
There you go. All right, which takes slightly longer to produce.
That would be a small field.
Or how many jars of jelly?
Right. Oh yeah, it's blackberries, turned into
I consider
jelly.
field size to be about 10 years old.
A half acre strikes me as pretty small for a field when you could have lots that are very large subject to this.
Okay, so I'm hearing concerns. We don't need to solve it all tonight.
Okay.
I'm hearing concerns about clearing for fields.
Sorry.
You mean separate from the building envelope? I mean,
Yeah.
in addition to the building envelope?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody agrees with me, but to me, a building envelope is where the house ought to be. But I don't think that should limit necessarily if you want a field or a pond or something.
Well, no, it's the
It is.
building.
That's what they're saying. You can't clear
envelope.
cut.
It's the building envelope. Yeah, it's simply.
It's the envelope for buildings, so field doesn't really.
Well, if
come
you
into
wanted
that.
to
Yeah,
make
but
a
it's the
field,
limits of clearing, though.
That's your
too.
limits of clearing.
Yeah, that's it.
Because I just,
If it is in
I'm
there.
thinking selfishly, but I always see these wooded lots, and I think, boy, it would be nice to put a house here and clear out the downslope so you could get some sunlight in from wherever.
And exacerbate the erosion into the brook.
Exacerbate the
That then's
erosion.
going to cause fluvial erosion.
Wouldn't that be
Eventually
nice?
flood my neighbors out down.
And then you better make them a nice offer on everything that's left over.
Right.
That's right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So
What
do
I'd
you-
say there is that,
I just like fields.
yeah, I
Nice.
think there's many, yes. So you'd rather be haying.
That
Well, but I
actually-
think people like fields.
Right.
I don't think we should be
That does make
Sorry,
sense.
your pip-
fields.
You can't, well, if it's already
No, it's not so bad.
a field
Yeah.
and you want to do solar, if you can't do your solar, could be outside your building envelope, but it already has to be clear cut.
I think James just wants to be outstanding in his field.
So for the purpose, because it's 10 of 8, I'm sorry, James, if I'm
No, it's all right.
overstepping your chairing duties, but
No.
what I hear what you're saying. I hear your concerns about building envelopes. Why don't I propose some language,
Well, if I'm
some
in-
alternatives?
Well,
If I'm the only guy who thinks this, we shouldn't. I mean, I don't want to be the sole voice here.
I guess maybe we should kind of take a poll of, now that we all understand that this is just the traditional subdivision and not the conservation subdivision, maybe people feel differently about having the amount of flexibility that people want, because the flexibility is in the conservation subdivision and not in the standard. So maybe for this standard write-up, we're more content with the rigid definitions that exist in here.
Mhm.
How do we feel about that?
I think that's legitimate.
You know, before Sue goes and writes more flexibility into something that should be more inflexible, and save the flexibility for the,
I just want to know what Jimmy down there thinks, because he was,
I was the most vehement.
yeah. And I wasn't sure
Anti-government.
again whether you were.
I didn't even know if you guys were speaking
He's been
to this or
drinking a
just
lot
in
of
general.
tea, I
So it's
reckon.
a,
Yeah.
Well, I have to admit, I was thinking more along the lines of conservation
Yeah, I
subdivision
was
when this conversation was happening. I actually
Yeah.
thought that's what we were talking about.
Right. No, I did too. I knew we were talking about that. I didn't know you were all speaking to this.
Right.
There's not a clear change in subject.
Okay.
We
I mean,
kind of just-
I followed you.
In general, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to speak to these exact numbers, right? Half acre and this, but in general, in regular subdivision, I think the spirit is appropriate here. I don't know what the exact number should be, but I think the spirit is appropriate to have some sort of definition in there.
Okay, so to go back to Liz's point, say James wants to have a field, or preserve the right to have a field. And so he comes to the office and we say to him, don't do a conventional subdivision because then you're going to have to declare your building envelope and then you pretty much, that's it. You've shot your bolt, you're done. If you do a conservation subdivision, on the other hand, you can declare that what you want to do is establish this, high meadow or whatever it is, and engage in thoughtful and sensitive clearing, show how it won't have an impact on erosion or downstream habitat, and then go ahead, have it.
Problem is, it's the seller's choice,
Well, you'd be...
I think you take away a lot of value from anyone who is just too lazy to do the conservation subdivision. And then you've got a lot that is heavily forested level and can't really be cleared. I mean, a half acre with a house on it is a pretty dark little area in rural.
If it's all wooded.
Have you driven around?
Huh? If
There's
it's
a
all
lot.
wooded.
There's a lot of little houses
There's a lot of that.
in half-acre openings all over
Yeah.
the place.
Well, I know it
Yeah.
fit. I don't know.
Yeah,
No,
no, I
no,
get what
no.
you're saying, but
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
I bet you there's just as many people who, they had their druthers, would like to be tucked away in the woods as being out on the plain.
I understand. I'm saying I think you take the value away from a lot. I think
Yes.
you lessen its potential. And I think it would be easier to avoid that by saying the building envelope is for your house and your garage, and maybe there's a limit to how much you clear that's slightly higher, but I don't see why you couldn't have a little more
Yeah, I can't remember what he called it. It's in Maryland.
to do outbuildings, to clear
Was
the
it,
field.
was it a
whatever.
tree plan?
No, it wasn't a tree.
Just when I think building envelope, I think house and
Yeah,
garage goes here.
but the other thing that I think I was just remembering
Yeah.
was that one of the goals of, well, again, this is the standard subdivision, but what we're talking about in the rural areas is that we want to limit the building envelope because of its erosion potential and then therefore flooding potential, because that was on the list of things that we needed to keep in mind with regard to
I wouldn't have a
tropical
problem if-
storm Irene.
I wouldn't have a problem if it was a little bigger. It's just a half acre seems really small to me for these parcels that could be conceivably, 30, 40 acres.
I wonder if there's another way of handling it. I mean, the limits of clearing made its way in for precisely the reason that Liz had mentioned. But speaking with Chris Campany, and he brought it up at the workshop in the afternoon, and we cannot recall what he called it, but in Maryland, they actually do regulate
Tree clearing.
tree clearing. And so maybe if we could, maybe we can get at tree clearing a different way than through
Right.
the building envelope.
Their issue there is it's the Chesapeake Bay area. It's in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and so there's a very strict relationship between cleared land and solids erosion making its
Runoff into the bay.
runoff into the bay.
basically.
So yeah, exactly. So they really want to see why you want to cut down those trees
Right,
and what impact it's going to have.
right.
And how are you doing it to,
Right.
yeah.
And so
I think Chris was going to send
we're not under the same kind of mandate from the EPA yet, but I think it would be worth looking at something like that. And
I don't think we should be clearing willy-nilly either. It's
Right.
not that. It's really not. It's just a
Yeah.
half acre seems small
Yeah.
for
Right.
clearing. Not
Yeah.
small for house, but just clearing.
right,
Yeah.
That's all.
okay.
What happens when, where does Sosimo get all of their
Trees from?
goods from?
Heavy cuts are regulated by the
Right.
state, but that's over 40 acres.
Yeah.
So they might need permits from the state.
Generally, the amounts at which they buy, it's that it's coming from land that's got a plan.
Yeah.
And then even when it's under that, a certain amount of their supply would also come from parcels that are in the help me out here, the current use plan, which is a way in which property owners with 25 acres or more reduce their tax burden by saying that they have a forestry plan for their 25 acres. Now you can have a stand of hardwoods or whatever that's of sizable value, and you can have a forestry plan that harvests them at a certain rate. And so, again, combined over, whatever Sosimo buys a certain amount of that lumber too. So there's that would account, I think, for the majority of lumber that they buy.
Can I, are we going to discuss fluvial erosion as well tonight?
I don't think we should.
Okay, I would just like to put out there that we find some happy way, because I think it's a great discussion that needs to continue, some happy way to conclude where we are tonight.
Does it have to be happy? Or does it have to be concluded?
We have to have something.
Okay.
Because I don't think we want to get up and be like, where did we end?
Oh.
And if we decide we're just going to keep talking about it, I think that's completely fine.
How about this?
But I think we should decide something to bring us to some sort of closure.
How about this? At the next meeting, we'll consider going straight yield, no minimums. Is that okay with everybody?
Or she was going to research it.
Yeah. I'm saying we'll talk about it next meeting.
Does that work for you guys to do?
Yeah. We don't meet till May 13th.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one way of presenting the issue. So it's for and against
We don't meet until May 13th?
minimum parcel
Yeah,
size.
2nd and 4th.
May's a weird month.
You don't.
I'll
When
just-
I even get a piece of meeting.
you gave me your dates,
Spent all that money. You don't miss out on anything?
Well,
I'm so sorry.
and let's deal with the minimum lot size in the development envelope in a conservation subdivision then. And,
So we
Well,
can keep
I
them.
mean, those are really our two big things, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we got, well, yeah, it was,
Boil it down.
it was minimum envelope in the standard subdivision and minimum envelope in the conservation, really, I think.
All right, so
Is the two things we're talking about, right?
I think if the staff brings us some educational materials or sends it to us beforehand and we're ready, I mean, if we have to, we'll vote it. It's not a terrible thing. Or maybe we'll come to a consensus, but, that's why there are bylaws and rules of order and all this other junk. So let's just be ready to straighten that out next meeting.
Okay.
And if we could straighten that out, how much more do we need before we have a draft subdivision regs?
Of all the different articles?
Yeah, because
What else?
Well, we're almost there.
Yeah.
I just,
Four.
you keep asking me that, and I
know.
just feel like I'm being pushed, and
Could be.
this has been a crazy
I know,
month,
right?
so I'm kind of a little out of touch on what I need to fix
Okay.
up on the other. So
we'll try. If we don't, we don't.
liberal would be towards the end of June. I mean, or conservative, sorry, would be the end of June, but I think that there'd be something before that.
Okay, well,
Because there's the subdivision, the standard one, and then there's the
Conservation.
conservation, and then
Yeah.
there's
There's some
other little
there's some
things.
stuff.
Yeah.
We're not under big pressure.
So ideally-
We have a lot of developers knocking down our doors.
so we'll
Oh,
resolve
you'd be
those,
surprised.
we'll resolve those two questions next meeting, and then we can do the fluvial erosion hazard more meaningfully and talk about
Okay.
the history, the problems. where
At the
we
next
are.
meeting also?
Yeah, because I don't think it'll take us long. I mean, we've had a lot of the discussion already here, and I think everybody knows where they stand.
Well, the end of this meeting actually convinced me that fluvial erosion somehow is connected to this.
It
All
is.
things with trees and,
Yeah.
Yeah.
they're kind of hard to do
Yeah,
separately.
it's in there.
True.
Well, they're easy to do separately, but they are all connected.
Well, they're separate ordinances.
I'm sure they're easy for
but,
you
yeah.
because you're like smart and.
No, just because I want
In
to
my
keep them
brain-
separate. No, I want them separate.
Mentally, it's important for us to keep them separate, but they are ultimately connected.
I mean, if we can't think of a good reason not to, I really think it's wise to get to do the yield and get rid of the minimums. I think it'll be a lot more palatable for people.
Let's sort of propose some language and go through the various
Yeah.
scenarios so that people can see it.
I'm sure there's
Now,
also a
are
possibility
you-
you guys find something that makes it clear that I'm completely wrong, but that's how I feel now. So let's.
James,
do
are
that.
you talking about all throughout the subdivision, or just, or keeping it in the standard and having the yield in the conservation?
I was talking about conservation, but maybe it's wise to do it all around. I don't know.
Well, I was
talking about
leaning towards
conservation.
conservation.
Yeah,
Mm.
that feels better to me.
Because that, that the first part of the meeting where Sue was talking about the yield and with the EPA people,
I mean, the thing is,
that
you
was
risk
a nice revelation.
you would risk pragmatic problems if we did the yield in the conservation as if we were raising to 3 and 10, and then tried to change the minimum in the standard subdivision to 3 and 10. But that being less palatable, it failed. Then suddenly the subdivision would become a much worse option than a standard subdivision, much less likely to get used.
Do we have to present and get the select board to vote on all this stuff at once, or can we do part of it at one point and part of it at another, so that they don't end up in the same discussion?
It'll all be in one
Yep.
one document, so it'll be presenting at once. But that's actually something that I've been thinking about, is maybe getting ourselves in front of them.
Yeah, it's not only about the rules;
conservation
it's about
subdivision.
communicating the rules in a way that can be done
Oh, yeah.
reasonably,
Yes, we've
efficiently, and
learned that, haven't we?
understandable.
Right.
It's
I
the
think
education thereof.
I think a takeaway from the experience of getting the town plan adopted was that it might be more beneficial for us to discuss progress with the select board and present scenarios with them and try and elicit from them their reactions. I mean, so that we've got some kind of direction from them, I
Yeah.
think.
And again, they made it quite clear that they want our goals to be like evidence-based.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure.
James is
about
an
that.
attorney; he can make up evidence.
It's hard to do evidence of something,
It
the way
doesn't.
something is going to happen. Even if you're comparing what things
Well,
happened in other communities.
That was the old planning.
That supports.
There's only one Brattleboro.
That's right. Yes. Yes. Apparently.
Don't you forget it.
What I'd say there is that's the canny use of high evidentiary standards to resist any form of change. So,
Is that still on?
yeah. So we've got that figured out.
I'm just saying, I think it'll always be something of a problem.
Yeah.
And if we-
Yeah.
So you're saying there's always something.
the easy stuff is always done by the last board, or the one before that, or the one before that.
The good thing is that the subdivision regulations right now are.
Yeah. Yeah, they need to be changed.
Yeah.
Will we have the same situation where the select board can just amend it and write it?
No, I don't believe so. I'd have to pull out the statute.
I'm curious about that.
I don't think so. I think it's an up or a down.
Okay.
They send it back.
They send it back, and they would send it back with suggested changes, of course.
Okay.
And so you would be. It's a little
I
bit.
guess essentially it is the same
It's
thing.
a little bit different, but it ultimately.
But they can't
goes
amend
down the
it
drain
and
the
then
same
vote it
way.
in without us first.
I'm not
sending
sure.
it back.
I'm not sure. I don't think they can.
Okay.
But I'd have to check the statute.
So
on that.
yeah, my understanding is it's an up-down, and typically if it goes down, then they'll hand it back with suggested changes,
Yeah.
and then it's
And
up to
then
the planning commission to sort of figure out where their survival really lies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's.
That's my take.
Is everyone okay?
I move to adjourn.
Amend? Oh,
Not
okay.
amend, adjourn.
Okay. I'll second that.
Can you second?
Yeah. I'm a member of this board.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.